Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about something that may be a little esoteric, but something that game designers ought to think about. And that is, where does the interest in the gameplay come from in a game? In other words, what makes the gameplay interesting? It has to come from something or somewhere. Now, in general, this roughly equates to whether the players are playing against other players, that is, that you have a game, or whether the players are playing against the game environment. In other words, you have a puzzle, possibly a multiplayer puzzle, but still a puzzle. So let's take some examples. War games first. Well, war games can be designed two different ways. One can be designed as a puzzle where you're forced to follow history, and then the primary interest is the situation, the subject of the game. The other way it can be designed is as a game, and then the interest comes from the other player or players primarily, and secondarily from the situation. The more a game pretends to be a simulation, although I maintain that simulation is a nonsense word really, the more the game pretends to be a simulation, the more the interest comes from the game, from the situation, rather than from players or a player. Now, what about role-playing games? Well, to me, the interest comes from the other players, and also, of course, from the GM. Now, the GM may use a published module of some sort, or they make up what they're doing, and a lot of the interest comes from that. But primarily, RPGs are about players. What about Euro-ish games? Well, Euro-ish games tend to be puzzle-like and tend to be abstract. And to me, the interest comes from the designer much more than from the other players. There are many Euro games where you don't actually care what the other players are doing, or there's nothing you can do about it. You just play your puzzle and hope you execute it better than the other players. What I call a parallel competition, which is quite common, especially in outdoor sports. What about a single player role playing game? That is to say, a video game or a massively multiplayer online game. Well, the designers put the challenges into the game, and you can run out. This is why there are constant expansions to something like World of Warcraft to provide new challenges. But it's the game providing the challenge, which is to say the designer providing the challenge, not so much the players. What about what I call screwage games, where you're messing with the other players, messing with your friends? Sometimes people refer to this as beer and pretzel games, but they're not quite the same thing. Well, obviously, in a screwage game, the interest comes from your friends and how you're trying to screw them and they're trying to screw you. It doesn't need to be a complex game. It can be a simple game. What about party games? Well, this is interesting because sometimes in a party game, what counts is the other players. But some party games are designed so that the interest comes from what the designer has designed, not so much from what the other players are doing. What about, say, pick up and deliver games? Well, I think this mostly comes from the designer and the game and not from the other players, because in many respects, you are playing against the game, you are not playing against the players. Sometimes you don't really worry about what the other players are doing. Sometimes you do. It depends on the game. And if you want an example of this, Merchant of Venus is one of these games, and Firefly, I think, is one of these games. Um, they are popular with a certain segment. Well, I could go on and describe this about other games, but I think you get the gist of it by now. Thanks for listening.